Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us a week early this month in March to the Night with the Experts. This is a monthly program sponsored by Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago, Illinois, where we bring experts from literally everywhere around the world to you, courtesy of Zoom, of course, where you will have an opportunity not only to uh, acquire a good deal of knowledge and expertise from our experts, but the important part of the evening is that you'll have an opportunity to engage in dialogue, question and answer, back and forth for a while. I would mention to people we always record these events and they should be up on YouTube in the next day or two. And I mention that because later during the Q&A section, if you don't want to appear in the recording, turn your camera off or make sure you're off screen so that you don't end up in the recording. So I am really, really pleased about tonight's event. As I said earlier, we're a week early, but it was definitely worth it. At the beginning of the year, we decided we wanted to do themes over a period of certain months. And I was really pleased to conclude what we would consider our environmental justice component with nuclear with Dr. Mariah Gómez of University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I saw her last fall at an event at DePaul University in Chicago, where her PowerPoint presentation just really floored the audience. So we were very, very lucky to get her tonight. And I am going to turn this over to Jan Budart, my colleague and board member, who will do the introductions. So again, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Uh, Thank you for coming, everyone, and we're really happy to see you here. Uh, the audience we have is, as usual, got some very stellar people in it, and so we really appreciate your coming. I personally don't like to introduce the speaker because I would have to read what you can read yourself. And so I'm going to ask, and I do this usually, ask the speaker to introduce themselves because they're so much better able to tell you who they are. So I'm going to let Mariah Gómez introduce herself and then continue on to her presentation. And I appreciate it. Thank you, Mariah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mariah Gómez. I am an associate professor at the University of New Mexico, and I am also the interim director of the Southwest Hispanic Institute at the University of New Mexico. I want to thank David, especially for inviting me here to join you this evening. I see a couple familiar names on the screen. So hi to Yuki, hi to Norma, who are on tonight. As David mentioned, when I was presenting at DePaul in the fall, he talked to me afterward and asked me if I might be interested in giving the same or a similar presentation for Night with the Experts. And so I'm really happy to be here. Sorry for throwing off your last Thursday event, but it's almost 90 degrees here I live just outside of Albuquerque, just south of Albuquerque. And I just got back from University of Arizona a couple days ago where it's the temperature is heading over 100 this week. So we know that there are some major climate change issues happening across the world, across the country, where there's snow in Buffalo today and over 100 degrees in the Southwest. So um, I kind of start with that because it gives some important context for some of the things that we're seeing happening with the science and science-related fields. I was at a presentation last week by the Sandia National Laboratory historian who talked at UNM, University of New Mexico. And he said, he made a comment about how they can't use climate change in any of their reports anymore. And I thought that was interesting because even though they can't use climate change, there's sure no sort of getting rid of normalizing nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons discussion. And so one thing that I've been increasingly interested in, and I'm moving in this direction to think and talk about what's happening, particularly in New Mexico, is this idea of the normalization of nuclear weapons and what that means. And so today, that's what I'm going to talk about. And really, I'm leading with this research question: why have nuclear weapons become normalized in New Mexico, and what are the effects and consequences? And I think part of that is discussing what normalization is and what that means. And so, in order to do this, it's really important to talk about the historical context. You know, we're in almost 85 years of this history right now, and I think that it's impossible to think about the way that nuclear weapons are being normalized and the production of nuclear weapons are being normalized without talking about the history. So I'm going to just jump right in. And many of you are familiar with New Mexico. I've used this map before. It's not very good on a screen, but I like it because it continues to show sort of the geographical layout of the state. You see the two major interstates running north, south, and east, west. That's I-25 and I-40. And I think it's interesting because north of north of what we call the Rio Arriba, or the section of New Mexico that we call the Rio Arriba, north of I-40, is Los Alamos. And then south of I-40 is, in particular, you see there the Trinity site. And I'm going to talk about the Trinity site in a second, because that's really Los Alamos and the Trinity site are where this history begins. I want to start with a couple of additional points, though, because one of the things that I have had to admit to myself, I think, but mostly to myself, but also to others in the last few months, is for a really long time, whenever people would ask the question, why do you think New Mexico has been targeted for this nuclear industry and all of the work that's being done? And I've always looked at it as an intersectional issue, meaning that it's not just one contributing factor, but I've always ranked race and ethnicity as like the leading factor. And I think that's still one of the leading factors, but one of, like I say, that I'm starting to admit to myself is the fact that we're a very poor state. And I think the fact that we are poor, money poor, is a huge part of this reason, and that's sort of what I'm going to get into today a little bit. New Mexico was just ranked by Wallet Hub in 2026 as the worst place to live in the United States. And of course, I would disagree with that for lots of different reasons, which I won't get into tonight. But I think that, it's sort of difficult because I don't want to work from this deficit model. This deficit model meaning that we're consistently ranked one of the three poorest states, that we have a very limited job market, that we have this major dependency on federal dollars. But also there's this major this other part of it, this asset model where we have so many more things that I think that's where the race and ethnicity play in. And so you'll see a little bit of overlapping of that tonight. The other thing that I want to point out in terms of kind of situating New Mexico in this larger discussion is, for those of you who don't know, New Mexico contains two of the nation's three nuclear weapons laboratories or facilities in this sort of triad of the country's weapons complex. And one of the sort of interesting things that I was reminded when I saw the lab historian speak last week is that Sandia likes to dismiss itself as being the engineering arm that completes, the non-nuclear components, right? And I think that's sort of interesting because, of course, everything is working in tandem. And one of the things that I always say, and you'll see it come up again later, is that one of the tenets of nuclear colonialism is this idea of secrecy and security. And the left hand doesn't like to know what the right hand is doing sometimes, so to speak. And I think that's when you start to compartmentalize, like Sandia being the engineering arm or the non-nuclear arm, it sort of takes that emphasis off the nuclear work that they are a part of, like they are a major part of. And so that'll just situate us a little bit for this. Um, so when I like to ground this conversation of how New Mexico became the center of the nuclear industrial complex, for the United States and arguably for the world, one of the things that I always come back to are these three periods of colonialism, settler colonialism, that have occurred in New Mexico. And settler colonialism is essentially what we're seeing happening in Palestine right now. Where we see it happening in other places in the world, and we've seen it happen. I think one of the really interesting things is that we are often taunted to believe that we are in this sort of post-colonial state or status, and we, of course, are not. And one of the things to think about with settler colonialism is this idea that the settlers never leave. And we definitely see this happening with nuclear colonialism. It was recently pointed out to me, like, or asked of me, I guess, like, why don't you include the Mexican period as part of this? And the Mexican period, which was essentially a 100-year period from 1821 to, well, almost 100-year period from 1821 to 1821 to 1848, 20-year, not 100-year, sorry. Um, it's an important period, but it functions a little bit differently than these other periods. So in terms of thinking about that first period with Spanish colonialism, and I'm going to say this for a really important reason that comes up later, Spanish colonialism also brought the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has been one of the biggest has brought some of the worst effects to the people living in modern day or so-called New Mexico since the late 1500s, late 16th century. With American or U.S. colonialism, which I mark with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, that period, that territorial period, New Mexico remained a territory from 1848 till we became a state in 1912. And that 64-year territorial period is really, really significant when you entertain the arguments for why they would not allow New Mexico to become a state. One of the major causes was because of who occupied New Mexico. And Congress was very concerned or had major tribulations with the fact that there were too many, quote, Mexicans and Indians living in this area. And that was majorly what kept New Mexico from becoming a state until 1912. And that period is a period that I'm currently working on and thinking about right now in my research. And then nuclear colonialism, which I mark in 1942, which is when the U.S. Army began to acquire Los Alamos or the Pajarito Plateau for Project Y or Site Y of the Manhattan Project. Okay, so when you think about what is nuclear colonialism, this is a term that a lot of you are probably familiar with and you've heard before. I am not the first scholar to write about nuclear colonialism. In fact, one of the things that I contribute to this definition is that it's not just thinking about indigenous populations, but also when you think about it as a neo-colonial framework, it's also targeting other ethnic minority groups in those poor economic situations. So like I stated earlier, it's ethnicity and race, and it's also that situation of poverty. One of the other things that I've written about is thinking about how these BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are manipulated to become a disposable workforce. And so when we think about what constitutes a disposable workforce, this really starts in the 1940s. And the way that I continue to define nuclear colonialism is not really with those textbook definitions, although they're important, but I like to think about it in terms of the five tenets, or what I've called the five tenets. So where you see nuclear colonialism occur, not just in New Mexico, not just in the United States, but other places throughout the world, you see forms of intergenerational trauma, you see death and disease, you see contamination, you see secrecy and obscurity, and of course, environmental racism. And I know that this is sort of the last talk, the Meet the Experts, Night with the Experts, with thinking about environmental justice issues. And so a lot of what I'm thinking about in New Mexico right now has to do with environmental justice. And of course, I'm not the only one. There are lots of groups that are concerned with thinking about environmental justice as it pertains to the nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico right now. On November 15th, 1942, this is when General Groves and Robert Oppenheimer and a couple of other people entered into Los Alamos. They had looked at a couple of different sites when they were trying to cite Project Y. And I think that it's really, really important to think about these stipulations and the way that Groves frames them. In his sort of tell-all memoir, Now It Can Be Told About the Manhattan Project, he writes, in considering suitable areas, we had to take into account a number of factors that did not apply to the location of our other sites. Although outwardly the requirements for Project Y appeared quite similar to theirs. We needed good transportation by air and rail, adequate water, a reasonable availability of labor, a temperate climate to permit year-round construction and out-of-doors experimental work, and all the other things that make for an efficient operation. So one of the things that I have argued is that Los Alamos actually didn't meet any of those stipulations, except that there was access to a reasonable availability of labor. And what they ended up doing was that they made a labor force out of the local populations living off the plateau, predominantly what we would call Hispanic today, Mexican American, or Mexicanos. At that time, many of them were still calling themselves Mexicanos, using the Spanish appellation, or Mexicanos de aquí, which means something very different than using the English translation, the literal translation of Mexican. That's not to say that they considered themselves Spanish, though. In Spanish, they would refer to themselves sometimes as Hispanos, which really had to do with a hemispheric identity rather than a Spanish identity, but that is obviously debatable, and a lot of people have written about that. And then the Tewa speaking people of the nearby pueblos. So San Ildefonso Pueblo, Santa Clara Pueblo, were the two pueblos and continue to be the two pueblos that are the closest. And of course, these people spoke predominantly Spanish and Tewa, and very few people at that time were speaking English as their dominant language in these nearby communities. So it was advantageous to them, because of the secrecy of the project, to use those locals as the labor force. And of course, here we mean the blue collar workers, not the scientists that were brought to New Mexico, to Los Alamos. That is part of the dominant narrative and the mainstream narrative that we hear all the time. That we hear especially in the Oppenheimer film. And then he continues, as before, we sought an isolated area so that nearby communities would not be adversely affected by any unforeseen results from our activities. And that line just continues to get me, because as I've looked at it sort of in the sense of the effects that have to do with health or that have to do with disease and death, now I'm really, really interested in thinking about it in terms of this growth and this normalization of the nuclear weapons complex. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit later. I do want to mention, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this history, that there were over 3 dozen Nuevo Mexicano, or Spanish-speaking New Mexican, farming and ranching families who lost their land during this takeover of the Pajarito Plateau. They were not, the federal government did not um, follow the proper procedures that are required and necessary under eminent domain. And because of this, they were later sued through a class action lawsuit that was filed by the Pajarito Plateau Homesteaders Incorporated, which was comprised of families and their descendants of those families. And they settled in the early 2000s, and the court ruled in favor of the families. So part of this process, and this part of not following the due process that was charged against them, was that Nuevo Mexicanos were not able to negotiate the valuation of their property. So in the case that proceedings were held, people didn't know about them because they either didn't receive the declaration of taking, or as Spanish speakers, and some of them who were illiterate in either language, they were unable to understand English language letters that they received. They also lacked access to attorneys to assist them in any negotiations, and they were unable to defend themselves. They didn't have access to finances either to pay for those attorneys. And so what ended up happening is some people didn't receive any money for their ranches, and there was not an equal amount paid to those who did receive money. So anywhere from $7 to $15 per acre. The The other private property that we often hear about in the master narrative of Los Alamos included the Los Alamos Ranch School that received a lot of money, including my favorite fact or statistic here is $3,650. That was for a football field, a hockey rink, and 5 tennis courts alone. So approximately 70% of the private property purchased, quote unquote, purchased for Site Y was homestead property or ranch property. Once they started the Manhattan Project, another thing that is constantly or consistently, I should say, left out of the Los Alamos history is that of the radioactive lanthanum tests. So because when they got to Los Alamos, they knew that the uranium bomb was going to work as they developed it and worked on it. But they had all of this plutonium made and pretty quickly realized that that plutonium was not going to work for the same type of weapon, same type of bomb and detonation. And so they needed to develop a new weapon essentially for the plutonium. And what they did was they started a series of tests called the radioactive lanthanum tests that were related to this trigger and that were related to this new bomb and the components required for this bomb. And they conducted these tests in Bio Canyon, which is one of the finger canyons up on the Pajarito Plateau. This is an image of Bio Canyon in 1950, so it's after the bombs were dropped in Japan, but it's before Los Alamos sort of opened, quote unquote, opened the gates to the public in 1957. So Los Alamos was still sort of a city on the hill behind the fence, but not so secret at this time. And so those radioactive lanthanum tests was a series of 254 explosive tests that started in September of 1944 and concluded in March of 1962. They range, well, let me jump ahead. So in terms of thinking about what happened before the Trinity test, because we often consider the Trinity or rightly consider the Trinity test the first atmospheric nuclear weapons test, but there was actually nuclear testing through these RALA tests that happened before the Trinity test. Wasn't a large scale bomb, but they were radioactive tests that released not just radioactive elements, but also heavy metals from that test. And so before Trinity, which took place on July 16th, 1945, there were 32 RALA shots that had taken place in Los Alamos and Bio Canyon before that. There was one criticality incident that happened during the RALA test, and that happened in late 1945 after the 2 bombs had been dropped in Japan. This is an image from these shots, and LAHADRA is the Los Alamos Historical Document Retrieval Assessment, which is a huge historical report that was written about not just the Manhattan Project, but sort of the effects of the Manhattan Project that was published in the 2000s. And this image is one of those historical images of a Rala shot from 1947. So you could sort of see how that happened, or how that chamber was prepared for that shot. So I want to jump ahead to the July 16th test, which was the Trinity test. What I want to say about this is not necessarily to read off of the screen. You can read it if you want, but it's important that we recognize that they actually had another set of stipulations that they needed to meet for that test. They actually didn't have the perfect conditions that they knew that they needed. And even though they carried out the test and they did have meters set up so that they could monitor the fallout of those tests, some of those meters actually didn't work, and some of them rang to the levels that they were supposed to evacuate those communities. One of those communities was a small town called Carizoso, which was close to the Trinity test. And people, it's often called the day the sun rose twice. People thought that the world was ending. The blast was so strong that in some homes, 20, 30 miles from ground zero, it blew out windows and houses. People who were outside in that morning, either getting ready to start their day on the land or working for the railroad. One of the testimonies that I collected when I was working on my book was the son of a man who worked on the train, and he had just laid down on a bench and closed his eyes, and he saw the blast behind his closed eyes. So this was really frightening for people. What's more frightening is that because they didn't actually evacuate anyone, and they told the community, it was published in the local papers, that a munitions dump had exploded, so nobody had any cause for concern. Much less did they even know what a nuclear weapon was at that point, right? Not until August 6th and 9th, um, which was a few weeks later, did they even realize what was happening and what had happened in southern New Mexico. So those two events really start what is, sometimes called the new nuclear age, or the nuclear age, or the birth of the nuclear age, or the atomic age. And now, 80 years later, I'm really thinking about this not just in the form of colonialism, because that is sort of that contemporary reality that we're still living in that form of settler colonialism, but really more so thinking about it in terms of coloniality. So when we think about coloniality, the question is, how is that different? And I'm going to read part of this quote. So, nuclear colonialism was launched when the US government entered Nuevo Mexico with the Manhattan Project in 1942. Since then, a vast nuclear industrial complex comprised of military and corporate entities has changed the logic, metaphysics, ontology, and matrix of power in New Mexico. In other words, we are no longer dealing with mere state sponsored nuclear colonialism. Rather, we are deeply embedded in nuclear coloniality, which differs in that coloniality, as opposed to colonialism, refers to long standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. So, this is where the normalization comes in. Nuclear weapons development has been so normalized in New Mexico that it has everything to do with our culture, our labor, our relations, and our knowledge production, well beyond the strict limits of those administrations of the federal government. I'll give you one example, and then I'm going to go into a lot of different examples. The culture example is one of the really interesting ones, I think, because you see all of these instances of it throughout New Mexico. Right now, I'm writing about one of our famous authors. I don't know if anybody is familiar with him. His name is Rodolfo Anaya. He's passed away already, but he's very famous for writing Bless Me Ultima, and is considered the godfather of Chicano literature when he wrote this book in the late 1960s during the Chicano movement. And one of the things that I'm arguing is that in his literature, you see like this undercurrent of nuclear topics, but because it comes across as so benign, because we're so used to just seeing it that we're desensitized to it. He has a detective series, and the theft of a plutonium pit is one of the sort of core actions of one of the novels in that series, in that tetralogy. It's a series of 4 books. But another example would be like our minor league baseball team is called the Isotopes, the Albuquerque Isotopes. And there's some sort of discussion about how it was named after The Simpsons. But of course, we know that it's because of the weapons development and the 2 laboratories that are here in Albuquerque and Los Alamos. So there are things like that that I think have become aspects of our culture that we don't even really think about in New Mexico anymore. They've just become so ingrained, and it's part of these long-standing patterns of power. So, when I talk about the nuclear industrial complex, I'm not just really talking about the weapons complex. I'm also talking about the energy complex. And later on, I'll give some more examples, but I want to just lead with this one example that happened during this last legislative session that we just finished here in New Mexico. So, there was a bill on the table, Senate Bill 68, which had to do with the basically legalization or reframing and renaming of nuclear energy as renewable energy in the state. And one of the things that a lot of us are doing right now is we're starting to draw the connections between different things that are happening across New Mexico that are not being placed in the same conversation, or that's to say that they're not being placed in like the same newspaper article, but you can definitely see the connections. So, for example, at the same time as they're trying to make nuclear energy renewable energy, and the bill failed, by the way, um, there's also a big proposal for a buyout of PNM, which is our main energy provider for Albuquerque and the greater Albuquerque area, which is, Albuquerque's 500,000 people, by Blackstone. And those of you who are familiar with Blackstone know that one of the, or I would say the biggest piece of their portfolio right now is data centers, right? And what is the purpose of data centers right now? Well, data centers are being tied explicitly to AI, right? And they are needing data centers, and they're needing lots of power to data center to power data energy to power data centers. And where is the conversation about nuclear now being linked to these data centers to power AI, especially? Small modular reactors, right? And so even though we don't currently have small modular reactors, there is a huge push right now, huge push, especially because the Trump administration just deregulated the process for building all nuclear reactors, including small modular reactors. And now there's going to be a big push to get these through. So there's all these like hanging threads that when you link them all up, and of course there's some proposals for new data centers in New Mexico as well. I live about 6 miles away from a Meta, a Facebook data center here in where I live in Los Lunas. And so all of these things are coming together. If you follow the breadcrumbs, what happens? Okay, deregulate or get rid of or legalize, let's say, nuclear energy as renewable energy, open it up to create more data centers and get those built in New Mexico. And then New Mexico becomes the prime place to put these small modular reactors. So even though we right now don't have commercial nuclear reactor in New Mexico, even though we've paid into Palo Verde for years and years, and we're now trying to finally pull 100% away from that. Um, there are other things in the works that are uh, that where companies and corporations are eyeing New Mexico, and I think that the fact that we have this really elaborate weapons complex is laying the foundation for that. So when you think about, this is always my favorite graphic to use. It was a cartoon done by John Trevor in 2017. It appeared on Easter Sunday in our local Albuquerque Journal, looking at New Mexico as the nuclear option. And of course, this is a play on sort of the congressional nuclear option. But when you think about this sort of tongue-in-cheek nuclear option, it's because of all of the what some people have called the cradle to grave nuclear industry or nuclear industrial complex, which is what I've called it at some point. In my book, I call it that. Now I'm trying to move away from that language, because I think thinking about the death drive in this case, and the birth rates and babies and what this does to reproductive systems is very real. But anyway, moving away from that, thinking about this sort of complex that exists now in New Mexico. So when you look at this, it's a little bit, of course, 2017, it's now outdated, and there's one error in it, which I'll point out, but it starts with you can see my cursor? It starts with the Manhattan Project here in Los Alamos. And I'm going to actually go counterclockwise here. So in what we call the Grants Uranium Belt, mostly on Navajo Nation and also in Laguna Pueblo, predominantly some of the largest uranium mines in the world. Laguna Pueblo, the Jackpile Powati mine in the village of Powati in Laguna, was the largest open pit uranium mine in the world through the 1980s. And then you move to nuclear weapon storage, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later at Kirtland Air Force Base, where over 2,000 nuclear weapons are being stored right now. You see the site where the Trinity test occurred in south central New Mexico here. And then moving to this sort of east side, there's some interesting things. So you have two spots here where there were proposals for high level waste deep borehole research projects, and those were actually shut down. They never started because of the work of activists that really just made lawmakers aware of what was happening, and that got shut down before it started. You also had the proposal for a temporary high-level waste storage facility, which was the Holtec site. So even after the New Mexico State Legislature passed a law making it illegal to temporarily store high-level nuclear waste in New Mexico, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission still licensed the facility. And then last summer in 2025, it basically collapsed under them. Holtec pulled the proposal, and so it never went forward. That doesn't mean it's dead. It could resurrect. It's going to have to resurrect somewhere because, of course, we have a huge nuclear waste problem in this country. Nuclear waste is one of the things, probably the most major thing that connects nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, because of the ways that both of them produce high level waste. And we have no plan as a country, much less no facility, much less a plan for what we're going to do with high level waste. Here we move to spent uranium processing, which of course we know the United States does not do spent fuel reprocessing. So this never came to fruition. And then this is the Urenco facility, which is the uranium enrichment facility. This is the error, which is, it says low level waste storage. We actually don't have low level waste storage. What we have is transuranic waste storage, and that's the waste isolation pilot plant. And there's a big difference there. I'm not going to go into the differences. United States does have multiple low level waste storage facilities, only one transuranic waste facility that's in New Mexico, and no high level waste facilities. So when you think about this, and I make all these gestures like a circle, but of course it's not a circle, it's not a cycle. This is what many people have started to call the fuel chain when we think about nuclear power and nuclear energy. When you think about that, what they call the front end of the cycle or the top of the cycle, it's the mining, the milling, the conversion, the enrichment, and the fuel fabrication, much of which happens in New Mexico. And then it goes to the reactor, right? So like I mentioned, we don't have the commercial reactor in New Mexico. We are starting to divest. We are almost permanently divest or fully divested, I should say, from Palo Verde. Then it comes out as waste and it goes to interim storage. This is something NEIS has taken up a lot, which is the waste that's being stored on site at all of these reactors. One of the things that I talk a lot with my students, I'm actually going to be teaching a new class this fall called The Legacy of Nuclear Waste. But in my other classes, we already talk a lot about how when you think about the reactors, they're actually not closed, they're decommissioned, and what that means, right? Because I think for the majority of people, when they encounter this language about decommissioned reactors, they think of them as closed reactors. And the difference there is really significant because, of course, as taxpayers, we're paying the federal government to pay the reactors to keep all of this waste on site. And that's only one of the issues that we should be concerned with. And then spent fuel reprocessing, we actually don't do spent fuel reprocessing in the United States right now, and we have no site for final disposition. So when you think about this fuel chain, we're stuck like right here, right at the interim storage. And a lot of this is happening in New Mexico. When you think about the interim storage of nuclear waste, we have Area G in Los Alamos, which is one of the most dangerous sites because it has all of the high level waste, what is often called legacy waste, some of which is still around from the Manhattan Project. And in fact, there have been two major forest fires in the Los Alamos region. And during the last fire, officials said that if Area G were to catch fire, during the first fire, so when that first fire happened in 2001, I was in high school, and I remember a friend of mine who's one of their parents was a firefighter, and thinking about all of that, we thought that Area G had caught fire. That was a major fear for people living in the valley. And then during the second fire, they said that if Area G were to catch fire and the fire were to get to that part of the facility of the lab, that they would throw fire retardant blankets over it and hope for the best. And to my knowledge, like they will not move the drums, the 55-gallon drums and other um, containers that have the waste there. So it's a major issue. And so what we have now, what I'm starting to call this nuclear fuel chain plus, we do the uranium mining, milling, conversion and enrichment across indigenous homelands. Navajo Nation has passed several laws preventing the transportation of uranium across Navajo Nation. We know that in parts of Navajo Nation right now, they have already started new enterprises for uranium mining, Pinon Pine being one of the biggest ones that we're watching right now. And then thinking about nuclear reactors, so thinking about Palo Verde, which is also the only reactor that is inland, meaning it doesn't share a border or it's not on a body of water. We have the Holtec storage facility, the consolidated interim storage facility, which was just pulled off the table, but there's still residual effects coming from that. And then the spent fuel reprocessing and the disposal, like I say, we don't do. But in New Mexico, what we also have is we have weapons development that's happening at Los Alamos and Sandia. And like I mentioned, Sandia tries to distract by saying that they are doing all the non-nuclear components, the engineering work. Starting in 1945, the Z division of the Manhattan Project was created at Kirtland, which by 1992 became the largest nuclear weapons storage facility in the United States. In 1957, there was also a hydrogen bomb that fell out of a plane and it detonated, but it did not have a plutonium bomb, which is why it was not like dropping a regular missile with a warhead out of it, because it lacked that trigger, that core, which I'm going to talk about soon. And then we've done we've had the Trinity test, we've had other nuclear tests, including the Rala experiments, and then we store other types of nuclear waste on site in New Mexico. So we have the waste at WIP, which is a permanent repository that they're now working to expand. We have the greater than Class C waste. One thing that often gets left out of a lot of these conversations is medical waste, the from nuclear medicine, that we also need to start talking about. And I've only recently begun to think about that in my own work. And then we have waste that's being stored at Sandia, at Lano, the contamination at Trinity and the nearby communities, etc. Sandia also has what's called the mixed waste landfill, which is a 2.5 square mile unlined pit of nuclear waste that's here in Albuquerque. So this gets me to this idea of this normalization of nuclear weapons. And so what I'm starting to track now, and I have a team that is going to start working on this concertedly, is looking at these effects and how they present in terms of normalization. What is normalization? What does it mean that we've normalized nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons development? And it's broken down into these facets. So thinking about the aesthetic, thinking about the socioeconomic, the psychological, the physiological, the political, the spiritual, and then these ethical realities. And so what I want to do is give a few examples of how those are coming into play in the last 10 years, basically, within the last 10 years. So what we have right now happening is a modernization process. And part of this modernization process, actually the majority, I would say, of this modernization process is happening here in New Mexico, because that's where the pit production is taking place. So this all starts really in 2018 with the Nuclear Posture Review that was released at the beginning of the first Trump administration. And there's a line in this Nuclear Posture Review that says that the United States remains committed to its efforts in support of the ultimate global elimination of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. So I find this very interesting that the official stance was that we will work toward the elimination, toward the total, ultimate global elimination of nuclear weapons, which, now in 2026, when you think about what's happening and with the war the US and Israel have waged on Iran, that's a lot of W's and R's there. The war that we are waging in Iran right now calls all of this into question as well. But later in the document, it basically says that in order to do that, we are going to start to produce no fewer than 80 pits per year by the year 2030. A delay in this would result in the need for a higher rate of pit production at a higher cost. So essentially what is happening is that in order to achieve this ultimate global elimination of nuclear weapons, we are going to start producing new nuclear weapons in the name of deterrence. And like I said, the entirety of pit production is happening in Los Alamos right now. Why is it happening in Los Alamos? Because in order to produce 80 new pits per year, the discussion was that 30 of those, or the decision, and Congress voted on this, that 30 of those pits would be produced in Los Alamos, which has been the only place since Rocky Flats was closed in the early 1990s when the FBI raided it and shut it down for crimes against the environment. Los Alamos remains the only place even today that's capable rather of mass producing plutonium pits. So Los Alamos got tasked with producing 30 of these per year, and Savannah River in South Carolina was charged with producing 50 of those per year. As of right now in 2026, Savannah River is still not operational, which means the entirety of pit production and the modernization process is happening in Los Alamos. So plutonium pits are the core or the triggers of nuclear weapons. When I talk a little bit in a second about all of the nuclear weapons that are being stored in Albuquerque, for example, none of those warheads have pits in them. And so pits, as I tell the middle schoolers, are the part that make the bomb go boom. They're the triggers, right? That cause the rest of the weapon to detonate. So those pits that are being produced in Los Alamos right now are primarily being produced for the W-87-1 warhead, which I'll come back to. So what I want to do is give a couple of those examples that hint at these facets of this normalization that I showed a second ago, following that 2018 nuclear posture review. So in 2022, not very long afterward, the Archbishop John Wester of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe here in New Mexico writes what is the pastoral letter that basically calls for nuclear abolition. Now, this becomes a really fascinating document for several reasons, and from 2022 to 2026, it's taken up a lot of steam. This sign right here, the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral, comes from Pope Francis, that quote. But in Archbishop Wester's pastoral letter was written after this comment, from Pope Francis. But what becomes really fascinating, and this sign right there is if workers are driving into Los Alamos and they're ascending the hill, this is on San Ildefonso tribal land, so it's basically the last community before you go up the hill to Los Alamos. And that's right on the right-hand side for traffic going uphill. And they see this every day on their way to work and have probably just become numb to seeing it. It's almost like it's not there anymore. And this call for abolition for me becomes really interesting because it's great that the Catholic Church wants to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons and sort of confronting this third period of settler colonialism in New Mexico. But in order to do that, they also need to confront that first period, which is Spanish colonialism, and the fact that the Catholic Church came with the Spaniards and what that meant for indigenous peoples. And so the fact that the Catholic Church then begins working with some of the pueblos, they get access to putting this sign on one of the pueblos, means that there's some sort of coalitional building that's happening there as well. And so a couple of other important things to think about with this Catholic Church call or the Archbishop's call for abolition is that when you think about the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, the majority or I shouldn't say the majority, but a large portion of the patrons of people who are attending church within the Archdiocese of Santa Fe work for the labs. And so what does that mean? That the Catholic Church is also simultaneously accepting tithes from the labs and from federal monies or from lab monies that are coming from workers who are making their careers and making their monies from the labs. So all of this is so intertwined that people are not even thinking about this. The next example that I want to give is how it's infiltrating politics. So, in a second, I'm going to talk about when the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was amended in 2025. But thinking about all of the political support that the labs have secured over the years, this was a letter written by Martin Heinrich in 2024, and you can read the whole thing. I mean, it's talking about how employment at the labs rose from 1,200 employees at Sandia to 16,700 employees within the year. But it's this highlighted part that I want to draw your attention to. Senator Heinrich says, throughout my time in the Senate, I have worked to maintain and grow New Mexico's national security and scientific research contributions. I have worked equally hard to prepare our military installations, national labs, and private industry innovators to excel in the emerging fields that will remain vital well into our future. So not only is this exhibiting this political support, and Heinrich's not the only one, all of our delegation consistently supports the labs and part of the military bases, and part of the reason for that is because the labs combined are getting more money to operate than our state operation budget. So we are getting more money in the state of New Mexico to run the weapons complex than the whole state of New Mexico has to operate the rest of the state of New Mexico, which is a fascinating figure that not a lot of people know about and not enough people are talking about. The next example comes from NNSA. So these are comments from early 2024 from Jill Ruby, who was the NNSA administrator at the time. This was after the modernization process started in Los Alamos. And she said, NNSA delivered over 200 modernized nuclear weapons to the Department of Defense this past year. So that was from 23 to 24. That was the fiscal year, the most since the end of the Cold War. Last year, more development pits were produced at Los Alamos than ever before. 9 full 87-1 development pit builds with 5 more partial builds. Los Alamos is on track to diamond stamp the first fully qualified war reserve pit for the W-87-1 this year. So these comments were made in April of 2024. By October of 2024, Los Alamos did produce that diamond stamp pit. And diamond stamp essentially means that it is ready to be put in a warhead. She says, we anticipate Los Alamos achieving the capability to produce the 30 pits per year envisioned by the two-site plan in or near 2028 with increased manufacturing rate confidence as we install equipment through 2030. Now, this is sort of interesting for a couple of reasons. One, by estimates, they are not going to be prepared to do this by 2030. They are doing round-the-clock operations, and as I'm going to show in a newspaper headline in a second, they have reduced the safety requirements at the lab, which obviously is part of this sped up and accelerated pit production that's happening there. In October of 2024, the associate lab director said, we have commenced war reserve pit production. This is a huge statement, right? So this W-87 warhead is a new weapon, which will top the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. So what this alone does is it kind of calls into question this rhetoric that this pit production is to maintain the existing arsenal, because they're not just producing pits to replace the pits that are in current weapons that still, according to experts, have at least 20 more years in them that they can be used. They are actually developing these pits to be put in new weapons that are being developed at Lawrence Livermore right now. I want to show this very, very short video. Secretary of Energy Chris Wright visited Los Alamos in February of 2025, and I want you to watch it because I want to talk about a couple of things, so let's see if it will play.
I visited Los Alamos National Laboratory today, a true national treasure, formed during World War II, early in 1943. In 2.5 years, the Manhattan Project, in the greatest race of all time, scrambled to bring scientists, engineers, chemists from around the world to finish the evolution of nuclear physics and build an atomic bomb, with one of our adversaries on the same trajectory. Getting second place would have been a harrowing conclusion to that race. They won the race here at Los Alamos National Laboratory. That culture, that drive, that spirit of innovation, it's still here. And the next Manhattan Project is AI. This is a race that's equally harrowing to get second place in. AI is going to affect our national security. It's going to affect the pace of scientific discovery. It's going to affect our industries, our quality of life, and our future. We need to win the AI race in Manhattan Project 2. And a good part of that effort is going to be right here again at Los Alamos National Laboratory.
Okay, so a couple of things with this video. When this came out, when I first saw it in February last year, I thought, what are they talking about? We're not in a new Manhattan Project. We're in the same Manhattan Project. We are producing plutonium pits at an accelerated rate for new weapons in the name of deterrence, in the name of national security. That's the same project from 1945, right? A year later, now in 2026, I was like, oh my gosh, Mariah, of course AI is the new Manhattan Project. And not that I didn't, wasn't already thinking about AI and nuclear energy in that way before, but because of the way that New Mexico is going to be targeted for these data centers and then be targeted for these reactors and then be targeted for all of these things that because New Mexico already has the weapons complex, it's going to be an easy, maybe not an easy sell, but it's going to be part of the process to sell legislators and lawmakers on making the nuclear, on making the AI and the data center piece in New Mexico part of the equation because we already have the foundation for nuclear weapons. And so this becomes part of that normalization that Los Alamos is now going to be leading in AI, and we're going to win the war on AI or win AI. When that comment "win AI" came out, I asked all of my students to basically analyze that, and nobody could really explain what "win AI" meant. So maybe that's something we could talk about in a few minutes. So in 2025, then we have, and I'm just giving some data points that way we can think about, right? This normalization, this new normalization. So in 2025, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was reauthorized. It came in as part of this HR 1, or this big, so-called big, beautiful bill. So at the same time that it was expanding coverage for compensation for downwinders, which now included New Mexico downwinders because of the Trinity test and the Raleigh tests, it also meant that it was cutting rural healthcare. And when most of New Mexico is rural and most of the communities being affected as downwinder communities are rural, we're going to lose the majority of our healthcare access as we see this play out fully. Two dates that are important to include here and just that I like to point out is that the reason that the beginning of coverage was changed to September 24th, 1944 was to include the radioactive lanthanum test that started on September 21st of that year, and then changed the end of coverage from October of 1958 to November of 1962 because that coincides with the end of the Raleigh tests. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, I guess, this was the headline in one of our local papers, the Santa Fe New Mexican, on February 28th, I believe it was. The headline read, "Los Alamos National Laboratory to allow for additional annual worker dose," an NSA official says. And I want to read part of this. A National Nuclear Security Administration official last month said Los Alamos National Laboratory has increased its limits on the dose of external and internal radiation a worker can receive in a given year. I'm going to skip ahead. The statutory limit is 5 rem per year. Rem is a unit used to quantify potential radiation effects on the human body. A 2017 U.S. Department of Energy standard set an administrative control level for annual dose at 2,000 millirem or 2 rem, requiring prior approval for amounts above that. According to the Occupational Radiation Exposure Report for calendar year 2024, that standard also required each DOE site to establish its own administrative limit based on historical and projected exposure, and requires approval from facility management if an individual looked like they were going to exceed it. There's a statutory limit for dose rates, which is 5 rem, McDonald said in January. We had previously capped our administrative limits at 1 rem for very good reasons. So now you see just within this last month that they have increased the total amount of possible rem exposure to 5 rem per year, from 1 to 5, so that because of this accelerated pit production, meaning that more people are going to potentially be exposed, or that's what possibly could happen as part of these efforts. So just to end, I want to start wrapping up by thinking about the current U.S. nuclear weapons numbers, or by the numbers. These figures are estimates that were released by the Bulletin, or in an article published by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists very recently. And the stockpile number is listed at an estimated 3,700 warheads, with approximately 1,770 deployed. That means 1,370 are deployed on ballistic missiles, 300 on base, and about 100 in tactical bombs that are in Europe right now. That means we've got about 1,930 in reserve, and retired but intact number is about 1,342, for a total inventory of 5,042. And of course, these are estimates, right? And now we're building new weapons. I want to end with this statistic, thinking about where this leaves New Mexico in this story. And maybe this isn't the end, but really the beginning. So as part of this same article, they state that the location with the most nuclear weapons by far is the large Kirtland Underground Munitions and Maintenance Storage Complex south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this is basically on Kirtland Air Force Base. Most of the weapons in this location are retired weapons awaiting dismantlement at the Pantex plant in Texas. one of the things that I have been asking people lately, and not necessarily this crowd, but local crowds in New Mexico, and this can be anyone. I told an artist friend of mine who just got was awarded a grant that he'll be doing some research. He's going to be creating a big art project um, around nuclear issues. And I said it would be interesting for us to create a 2-question survey and administer it throughout Albuquerque. Do you know if Albuquerque has storage of nuclear weapons? Yes or no? And how many weapons do you think Albuquerque has? Because this number is estimated over 2,000, and I doubt anybody in New Mexico realizes that there are 2,000 nuclear missiles, although without plutonium pits that are being stored in Albuquerque at this moment. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I guess that'll take us into the question and answer portion. So thanks for bearing with me for that presentation. The purpose of that was really just to start getting people to think about what does normalization mean, and have we normalized nuclear weapons development in New Mexico, and what does that look like on the practical level, on the things that we can track, on the day-to-day events and activities, on our culture, on our intersubjective relationships that we have with other people. And I think that the evidence is starting to sort of come clear. And it's now our responsibility, my responsibility, other people's responsibility to draw those connections so that the public can start seeing those connections, because we are not being led to be able to create those connections on our own. Thank you.
Well,
Wow,
thank
that
you
was
very much.
marvelous.
Thank you very much. We were right last fall. You did not disappoint. Uh, I have a feeling that tonight's conversation is going to be very, very vibrant and could go on for a while. So I hope everyone has their energy drinks ready and handy. We'll try not to wear you out too much. But thank you. It was just an amazing, amazing presentation. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping for folks. And the first off is that we are recording this. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do not want to appear in the video that's recorded, turn your camera off if you're going to ask a question. I will open the chat in a moment. We keep it off at the beginning of the presentation because it distracts sometimes from the presentation, but it'll be on and you'll be able to put comments in there, links to other things. And at the end of the session tonight, those of you who attended will be getting a copy of the chat. So you'll be having access to any of the links or materials that appear in the chat as well. So that, I think, wraps the housekeeping part. And what I will do now is what I do every month and turn this over to Jan Budart, my colleague, who's going to tell you what happens next.
Wow, that presentation was really marvelous. I'm sorry for anybody that wasn't here. So I run the Q&A, and if you want to ask a question, you can go down to the bottom of the screen where it says React. And if you click on that, they'll see a bar that says Raise Hand. And that is the easiest way for me to find you if you want to ask a question. Other ways of doing it are opening up your screen and going like this. And I'll try to keep track of anyone who does that. And you can also put your question in the chat or just say stack. And then I will put you on the stack for asking questions. You may have one follow-up question if Mariah answers your question and it leads to something that you really want to follow through, you can have one follow-up. And if you want to make a comment, then I will try to time you for 3 minutes. If you're making a comment rather than asking a question, we'll give you 3 minutes and hope that I see Mark is approving that idea. And so anyway, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand one way or another, or put the word stack in the chat. And David and I will both try to keep track of what's going on in the stack. So we're open now to having you respond to this really fabulous talk that Mariah just gave. Wow. It was pretty thorough. Oh, here we are. Stephanie wants to ask a question. Hi, Stephanie. She's a member of the board at Nuclear Energy Information Service, and she is also our um, environmental justice expert. She follows a lot of environmental justice issues. So go ahead, Stephanie.
In the slide that you presented for specifically for RECA, I believe it was, you mentioned that because that was passed and on, I think it was 2 pueblos, you said they lost their health benefits. What was the reasoning or why did that happen that they lost other health benefits?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Stephanie. So let me clarify a couple of things. So with with the passage of RICA, so RICA as a law had already sunset, it had already expired, and so they had to bring it back through a reauthorization. And the only way to bring that in was to tack it on to the big beautiful, what Trump called the big beautiful bill, right? What I call the big something else bill, which I won't say on the recording. But you know, when you think about how that bill has the RICA reauthorization part of that bill is going to extend and expand compensation capabilities, right? It doesn't mean everybody's going to get compensated, and there's only a 2-year extension to try to do that. So as we're learning, lots of people, we've filed them for my grandparents already. Lots of people are filing them. We don't even know if they're going to get through in 2 years, right? But the other part of that big, beautiful, so-called big, beautiful bill is going to result in the elimination or the reduction in rural health care because of other parts of the bill. So it's not anything specific to a pueblo, any pueblos or any towns. It's just the way that the bill is writing in resources or the elimination of resources for rural healthcare across the country. So what that means is that even if people in downwinder affected communities or uranium miners or uranium workers, because it also expanded coverage for uranium workers post 1971. So those are the two populations in New Mexico that'll significantly get impacted by that, were the uranium workers post 1971 and the downwinders from New Mexico. It means that in the scheme of things, they'll probably lose access to rural healthcare. And in New Mexico right now, we have a major, major rural healthcare situation, which you're probably familiar with. The state legislature just approved a lot of money, especially for the University of New Mexico, which is the only regional trauma center, to do new development and training programs so that we can get some rural healthcare practitioners into these communities. So it wasn't any particular pueblo or particular community. It's just other parts of the bill that are going to play out to negatively impact rural communities.
Okay, thank you for the info. And Dave, not that I want to be on video, but it says that because I was going to unlock my video, it says that I can't because I was locked out. So anyway, just an FYI. I don't know what's going on there. Thank you, Mariah.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Bad hair day, I guess.
Wait a minute. I'm going to call on Catherine, but I'm just wondering if you can unlock your video, Catherine.
No, it says you cannot start your video because it's disabled, and the chat is also still disabled. So just wanted to let you know that. And I wanted to thank you, Mariah, for such a thorough presentation and such an amazing addition to our understanding. I really appreciate your slides. I'm hoping we can get copies of those. And I wasn't quite sure I heard, but I wanted to say how encouraging it is to the rest of the country that New Mexico fought the CSI or whatever it's called, the consent thing, and that's why it was abandoned because of the resistance in New Mexico. And I understand, do have a question too. I understand that the waste isolation pilot project, which has plans for expansion, also potentially I've heard nuclear waste proponents say that WIP could potentially also have enough room for becoming the repository for spent fuel. So I'm wondering if there's concern about that in New Mexico.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Catherine. there's definitely concern. I know Diane Dorigo's on the call and she may want to even jump in too on this answer. Um, there is pushback right now against whip expansion, but I think part of the concern is that the proposal from Holtec is going to resurface, right? It's a at least for some of us, we see it as a big win, but a temporary win, because somebody's gonna need to take this waste, right? DOE awarded, I forget how many, I want to say it was like 12 or 14. Don't quote me on the number, but there were a bunch of different awards that were paid out to different organizations, and most of them being corporations, not organizations. Holtec was one of the recipients. This was a couple of years ago, as a way to, they were pipelining money as a way to think in other, they were pipelining money to get people and corporations, I should say, to think about how to encourage communities to consent to siting high level nuclear waste. And so, as part of that process, some really interesting things happen. And right now, I'm forgetting the name of the project, I think, because I've been talking to.
Consent-based siting.
Say that again, Dan?
Consent-based siting.
Yeah, the consent-based siting. Yeah, for sure. But I'm forgetting the name of the grant project that
Oh,
DOE.
it was, I don't know the name of it, but it was 10 or 12 groups that each got $1 million or $2 to exactly what you said, to help. DOE is not real good, and so they thought if they could get universities and other groups in there asking questions and engaging communities, that maybe they could have another, have some access to somebody to volunteer.
Yeah, and so thank you, Diane. And so what we suspect is going to happen is that they're going to come back to the drawing board, create some new proposals, and then go back out using this information. I will say that there were some good projects that came out of this. One of them being a book that was created, that was published by by Arizona State University, called Our Radioactive Neighbors. I have a short essay in that book. Some other folks have short essays, but the reason I like that book is because it pairs speculative fiction short stories. There's four of them with these quote unquote expert essays. And I'm, as a literature person, as a college professor trying to teach this new generation to care about nuclear issues, I think that speculative fiction is one of the ways that we should be one of the tools that we should be using to be getting people to think about these issues. Because of course, like when you think about the realm of science fiction, science fiction by definition is if we stay on this path, this will happen, right? And so I'm kind of digressing now, Catherine, but I think they're going to come back to the drawing board. And then as far as WIP goes, there are people fighting the WIP expansion. We're getting ready now in April to commemorate this WIP trail. There'll probably be another event this year, which is turned into an annual caravan event here in New Mexico. But I think, and this goes back to like this idea of this nuclear literacy that a lot of us are talking about, is we've got to educate people on what's happening. And it's, I'm not the young one anymore. 10 years ago, maybe, or 15 years ago, I was like one of the young ones doing this work, but I am definitely not anymore. And I don't see a whole lot of young people doing this work. And I think the question that a lot of us are having is how do we get more younger people interested? When you look at the civil rights movements from the 60s and 70s, nuclear issues was a central part of that. How do we get nuclear issues back in all of these civil rights conversations and these bigger movements? I know climate change movement is part of that, but it's just all of it. And so it's that education where we really need to be educating people so that they can begin asking these questions, because when they get the information, then they are concerned. And I think that's what needs to happen specifically with WIP.
Thank you so much.
We could do a whole night with the experts on this consent-based citing. It's become a new name, I think, is called collaboration-based citing, and it's getting more and more attention. And it's been going. One of my first meetings was going to consent-based citing a long time ago, and it's getting nowhere. So the next person I'm calling on, and I really appreciate the fact that Diane is able to participate, is Becca. You have your hand up, and is it? Oh, maybe we can see you. There you are. Great. Okay.
Thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. You got me really fired up. And I thought Catherine might speak to this. Like Catherine, I live in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State and starting to do stuff around the Hanford site. And you may have heard that Amazon is putting in several hundred million to build small modular reactors for AI data centers. So I'm curious, are there particular data center fights that folks are coalescing around in New Mexico right now? Are they just oil and gas, or do you also have, nuclear powered proposals?
Yes. So thank you for that question, Becca, because this is really what I'm trying to get people to connect the dots about right now. So thinking about Amazon in particular, right? I mentioned the Facebook, the Meta data center that I have down the road from me. We have a Facebook, I'm sorry, we have an Amazon, what do you call it? Distribution facility immediately
Yeah.
next door to that, right? So the biggest fight that's being fought in terms of data centers is happening right now in southern New Mexico in Santa Teresa. And I bring up that Santa Teresa example for a really specific reason, not just because it's the big data center battle that's happening right now, but also because Santa Teresa was cited by cited SITED by Sandia a couple decades ago when they were working on some of the border security technology. So also I want to point out that a lot of this has border security wrapped in quote unquote border security, right? Wrapped up into it. It's all of this technology that has to do um, with maintaining this US Mexico border wall, right? And tracking. And so the labs are already implicated in that work as well. So it's like this whole network of not when Sandia says it's non-nuclear components, its non-nuclear components also include that sort of terror, right? And that's sort of just like another pin in that discussion. But that's all happening in Santa Teresa. So they had convened this big study group in Santa Teresa, and now that's where that data center is. And why Santa Teresa? It's on the US-Mexico border. It is a community, again, of majorly Spanish-speaking population, predominantly Spanish-speaking population. In my book, I give some figures, some statistics of those communities in that part of the state where the whole tech center, the whole tech site was being proposed. Because when you look at the population, a lot of those are undocumented immigrants or undocumented residents, and
Oh, she froze.
we see that.
Mariah, you froze.
Not for me, I can see her.
Oh, okay, good.
Mm.
So you see that also, oh, I lost my train of thought. So in
It's
Santa
mostly
Teresa, yeah, it's the same population, right? And so they have become an easy target. The New Mexico Environmental Law Center has taken that up and they are the ones leading that. And there's lots of organizations, there have been lots of public events, encouraging public participation. But like I say, like I see already what's coming down the pipe, right? Trying to make nuclear energy renewable energy at the state level. Thank gosh the bill failed. I actually got cut off during public comments. I was um I was reprimanded by the chair of the committee and I was put on silent during my public comment for shaming the legislators trying to pass that law. So, if all of these things converge, especially this Blackstone thing, if if our Public Regulation Commission approves this Blackstone buyout, it's going to fast track all of this. And so people are very concerned. The public is showing up in droves to oppose these things. And so as long as we are continuing to educate the public, the other thing that New Mexico does, I said early in the presentation, like I really oppose this deficit model. One of the things that New Mexico has historically done well is community and participant informed legislative participation, right? And so I think that if people can just continue to show up, we'll push back and we'll see things like the legislation that passed preventing the consolidated interim storage facility just continue to pass. So I don't know if that fully answered your question. I think that, New Mexico is being targeted right now. And maybe we're not seeing it abundantly, like we have one big data center, but if Blackstone is allowed to buy out that P&M contract, I think it's going to explode. And
Yeah.
if nuclear energy is brought in as renewable energy, I think we're going to see the proposals for small modular reactors.
Well, and as far as I understand, it's all of the Manhattan Project sites, Oak Ridge and Washington and New Mexico, and that, and clearly with the non-proliferation treaty expiring and everything that's happening in Iran, I think the consciousness around weapons is there, and this is the opportunity to connect the dots to energy and to telescope between these registers of the past and the present and potential futures. And I would be very excited um, like, I'd love to talk to you if you would be willing to share your contact info.
I would love to, and I'll toss that back up on the screen in a second with my email address, or I'll put it in the chat. I would love to talk more because yeah, that's part of that's part of the reason I wanted to show that Christopher Wright video, right?
Yeah.
Because, for me it was like, no, we're still in the same Manhattan Project. And then it just hit me like a ton of bricks one day. It was like, no, they're outright saying AI is the new Manhattan Project, and they're mapping it the same way, like you said, right? They're
Yeah.
mapping it with these same sites. So yeah, I'll put my email in the chat, Becca. Thanks.
Awesome.
And I wanted to ask I sort of had a comment to make about Jill Ruby and being in her capacity. It wasn't mentioned that the work that she was doing was part of the DOE, and that was under the woman who used to be governor of Michigan. I'm not going to be able to come up with it, but I think that when you were talking about Jill Ruby, it was not clear that this is a DOE part and that it is totally directed at weapons, and that the money that is spent by the DOE for this is probably, I don't know how they split it out, but there's a huge budget for weapons, and this DOE is not in the War Department. And this really bothers me. And I wanted to say WIP was promised to close in 2024. And when it was started, it was promised that it would be closed in 2024. But these promises never, once you open it up, oh, there's a picture of it. Ace put it up. Once you open something like this, the government will just break its promises right and left. So I guess my question was about Jill Ruby and the Department of Energy and how the funding for the Department of Energy is split out from the War Department. So uh, if you can answer that, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll go on to Norma, Dave, and Catherine again.
Yeah, I don't know if I can fully answer that with conviction. One of the things that I will say that came up for me as you were talking was the way that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission sort of just sits in limbo, right? It's not part of a bigger structure, it's just sort of its own arm. And I think that that's one thing that we should be considering as part of this. Is that nobody's really pulling the strings there, right? And in terms of thinking about WIP, um, yeah, the fact that it was supposed to close and not accept any more shipments, and that was the end of it. Um, and that's not what happened, and that continues to be like the absolute opposite of what's happening right now. It just further, like you say, it just is another example of how the federal government continues to break its promises when it comes to nuclear weapons. And I think all of those things, once tracked and once put in conversation with each other, it becomes obvious that you can't trust anything that they say.
Yes, and because WIP is the WIPP and PP stands for pilot project, and obviously it's getting to be more than that. Okay,
Right.
I'm going to call on Norma. Norma, you need to unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi. Hi, Mariah and everybody. Thank you so much. Um, I have a question, but I just wanted to say as a comment how ominously it's resonant with the model for Fukushima nuclear disaster recovery, which is inspired by Hanford. So you can see that that's not it's not very promising, but it will is transmogrifying into a huge project with all of these angles that you were talking about. But what I wanted to ask you was a conundrum, which is from that billboard, a memorable billboard on San Ildefonso Pueblo that you showed us, and Archbishop Wester's putting himself out there, putting the church out there on the morality of nuclear weapons, and it reminded me immediately of a Buddhist priest, no longer with us, living in the part of Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, which has one nuclear reactor, and most of his parishioners worked there. It's a very familiar structure, but he never gave up on his own stance against nuclear power, against nuclear energy in the operation of that plant. So I'm wondering if you can help us think further about this. Like there is the money base that's coming from the thing you would like to see shut down, yet you still want to oppose it as a social religious leader. What are ways to think about this and move forward? And also, as you pointed out, the fact that the federal government is such a huge employer in the state, and so many people are. It's a social economic power structure, coloniality, that has created this very this structure that's hard to break, and if you want to at least oppose it verbally. Can you just help us think further on that?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks, Norma. So what Becca just put in the chat about just transition, I think is part of it. And that's the one thing that I try to always say in these presentations, particularly when I'm giving them in New Mexico. I've never advocated to shut the laboratories down. What I've advocated for is shutting the nuclear weapons part of the laboratory down, right? Because there's so much science and there's so many other ways that we can be spending that money. And the just transition doesn't just have to be to renewable energies, but it can be to other industries, other types of scientific research. I think the lab, one sort of interesting examination of rhetoric for the lab's mission. Like the lab has changed its mission, the language of its mission. And at one point it had nuclear right in the mission, and then they removed that. And then they doubled down on being a scientific laboratory, and then they removed that. And so, I mean, just going back and forth. But if it is truly a scientific laboratory, right now they do like less than 5% of the research that takes place there is on things other than weapons, nuclear weapons, right? So I think the just transition is a really big part of it. I think that, just given one thing that I usually do when I start these presentations is talk about like how I came to this work, right? My grandparents were one of the families kicked off their ranch during the Manhattan Project. My grandfather worked in Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, and he and his brothers who worked there subsequently died of cancer. And when I see story after story after story about how these things have happened in our communities, people are very afraid to speak out against the labs, even when the labs has harmed them. And so it creates a really interesting power structure where people are very afraid to raise questions, right? For fear of being fired for one, or out of, being labeled alienated for another. One of my friends and good colleagues, Alicia Ines Guzman, has written for Source New Mexico a series of amazing stories. One of them that had a unionized electrician who spoke out, and there was fallout for him from that, right? And she's now doing a series of stories for the New York Times that I would encourage people to look at. I'll put her name in the chat. But yeah, I think that the fact that people are just afraid to have these conversations is a huge part of it. And I think that me personally, and I've had these conversations with the Archbishop, like if we were to be able to start those conversations at the local churches and do some sort of a grassroots, organizing where people are at least, if they have that relationship, maybe that could be a safe place for them to do that. But it would take a lot of work. It would take a lot of effort from a lot of different people to get that started. And I don't know what that truly would look like, but it's definitely something that some of us are talking about right now. It using the master's tools, in this case, the Catholic Church, I don't know. I don't know if it would be useful, but I think that we're getting to the point where it might be worth trying. And the Archbishop is getting ready to retire soon. We all know that. And so he has said that he's taking this up as like his major retirement thing. And maybe that's something that he could start after retirement. I don't know. But it's something that's driving me crazy thinking about. And I know I'm not the only one. Yeah.
All these issues are driving us crazy. I do have to say that it is 8:30. No, it's half after the hour wherever you are. And uh and this is technically we run to 8:30 and it's up to the speaker whether she wants whether she wants to continue and has the energy to go on and answer the rest of the questions that are coming up. So we this often goes until the hour, meaning an extra half hour, if you want to, Mariah. Otherwise, it's up to you to continue.
We can take the last three questions. That's fine.
Well, there's five. There's
Oh,
two
I
in the
only-
chat.
Oh,
So,
okay.
okay. So after Dave, I'm going to read Lori Johnston's question. I wish she always puts her question in the chat and
Well,
doesn't raise her hand. So after Dave, I'm going to call on Lori Johnston and then we'll call on Ace because he hasn't spoken and then Catherine. So, okay, go ahead, Dave.
okay, I'd like to recommend for questioners, no adjectives or adverbs. Just keep your sentences simple and we'll get through this a lot faster. Uh, obviously, you're focused a lot on New Mexico and you certainly have a wealth of knowledge about it, but if you're also a well-known speaker and you've written books, and I hope we get to promote that in the chat at some point tonight. So my question is some reactions you might have uh, acquired in your lecturing outside of New Mexico or wherever you do. And that relates to the nuclear weapons activist community and the nuclear power activist community. It drives me crazy that the two just don't seem to be able to work together, that they don't seem to understand that it's the same nuclear chain, only different magnitudes at different points. And my question, first question, it's a two-part question, is what sort of reaction do you get from the weapons activists when you bring up your nuclear power information like you did tonight? Do they react at all? And if so, what does it look like? And then I'll follow it up with something real quick.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll try to keep it short because I've been in two working groups and I won't give a lot of information, but I've been in two working groups that have been part of, people from across the nation in the last year, and this has come up, right? I think that generally the reaction from people who are very, very, very like staunchly looking at nuclear weapons issues, they're still not at the point where they want to think about it all. It's like, let's take care of this and then we'll get there, right? Which is unfortunate. I think that the other part of that that's frustrating to me is there's still silos even within the weapons discussion, right? So, I don't have the answers for that, but it was a suspicion I had, and now that I'm kind of been part of this work, like it is just very much clarified it for me that if people don't take the same political position on in terms of what we should be doing or how we should be approaching nuclear weapons, then it's very difficult to think through the processes, right? And so I'm sort of just trying to think about energy now as like a fourth silo. And if I personally think about it as a fourth silo, then what is the common language that we can use? Waste is the biggest one, right? Nuclear waste is the biggest issue, is the biggest like common denominator there. But I think there are other issues, and that's what I'm personally trying to identify as I'm in these working groups. Um, I think that the other frustrating one is that it's always like if they are used or when they are used, and people fail to see that in frontline communities, these nuclear weapons production is affecting frontline communities right now every day, right? I didn't even get into the environmental issues and concerns because that's like a whole nother thing. But right now in New Mexico, we have the chromium plume around Los Alamos National Laboratory that is very much threatening the aquifer of the neighboring communities. And so it's also as difficult as it is to get people to think about nuclear energy as being part of this nuclear fuel chain plus with weapons, right? It's also equally as difficult to get them to see that frontline communities are being affected right now and prioritizing that. And so I don't have a good answer. I think finding common language and thinking about it as like a fourth silo for me is helping me. I don't like to compartmentalize things. Like my brain works in looking at everything at once, and sometimes it's years of chaos before it makes sense. But I think in this case, for some people, it's helpful to sort of compartmentalize those. But we have to be talking about it. My fear, and what Becca's question brought up earlier, right? What she just put in the chat too. My fear is that these are going to become abundantly clear before it's going to be too late. And then we have no way, if all of a sudden we're going to have SMRs being built in New Mexico with no regulations, and it's right where weapons is happening, and then we become the dumping ground for the waste. I mean, this is part of my question about the normalization. Like, they were using that language several years ago with the whole tech siting process of the nuclear corridor, and I just hate that language. And the new book that I'm working on right now links this language of the nuclear corridor to this territorial period of New Mexico where they were trying to push who New Mexicans were to try to get a statehood. And it's the same way that they're trying to push who New Mexico is now as being part of this productive nuclear corridor. Let's build AI here. Let's do this. Like we're going to be at the center of technical development, and it's going to screw us over. So I don't think that's a good answer, David, but I think it's something that we just got to keep at.
You actually touched on the second question with some of what you said. I was going to ask for your opinion on the fruitful issues or elements where the collaboration was logical. You mentioned waste, for example. I'll just mention this and pass it on to Catherine. One of the things we've decided this past year at NEIS is whenever we're dealing with the government, it's always on their terms, with their language, with their standards, with their regulations. That always gets talked about first. And then there's 3 minutes at the end of the evening to talk about environmental justice. And I recommend that we, as a movement, start beginning with that. Uh, Start talking about these issues on our terms, with our priorities, with our language. And then if we get around to the RADs and the REMs and the Curies and the number of warheads, okay, let's put that 5 minutes at the end and we'll deal with that. Just a recommendation. Catherine, you were next, I believe, in queue.
Oh, I think I've already talked. I wanted to call people's attention to the nuclear life cycle campus idea that the Department of Energy is launching. Hanford is a potential site for this, and they're calling it Remediation to Renaissance. And April 1st is the deadline for states to say that they will take on all the phases of the nuclear life cycle, including taking spent fuel and disposing of it from commercial reactors across the country. So I put some links in the chat about that for people to know about, because this is the next iteration of consent-based siting, getting states to volunteer. So thank you.
Okay, and absolutely incredible presentation.
I have to interrupt because I was going to ask Lori Johnson to ask her question, and I could either read it.
I can read it too, Jan, out
Okay.
loud. is it this one? Are there references to contracts or text of business U.S. agreements in Nuclear Nuevo Mexico book? Is U.S. promising businesses in writing that they will be able to use nuclear privately for decades into the future? None that I'm aware of, Lori. This may be something that I start looking into, that we start looking into. I mean, I think, again, I think the breadcrumbs are there in looking at the legislation that was sponsored and sort of who the parties were. Llano and Sandia have tons of private contractors, and these private contractors account for a lot of the jobs. So a lot of the jobs aren't outright with the federal government, right? They're with the contractors. And I think that, like, the way I see this play out, and I actually don't talk about it in my book, but I should have. The way you see it play out is you have somebody who has like a small let me think of one, a small hardware store, right? That services primarily the labs. So no, they might not have an outright contract, right? But as long as they're there and as long as they're the only ones, there's a monopoly on it. So they're going to have continued work. And you see this throughout the valley, especially for Los Alamos. A lot of the businesses and the contractors are in the Española Valley, not necessarily in Los Alamos. So, yeah, I'm gonna look into this because I don't have a good answer for this, but I think it's a really good question. Email me in a couple months. We'll see where we're at with it.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for the question, Laurie. Okay, Ace, you're next, and then I wanted to call on Dave Lockman and then talk with Natalie Owl because she has a long thing in the chat that we need to look at. So go ahead, Ace.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about cutting in earlier. I forgot that you had mentioned it'd be somebody else. In Parsons, Kansas, they're digging a hole to put an underground reactor, and in Iran, they're hitting data centers. The pressure to put the reactors underground is going to be enormous, and I'm wondering if there's been any pressure like that, or if they not said anything about going underground with these data center powering nuclear reactors, which all of it is an incredibly stupid idea.
That's such a great question, comment, Ace. So to my knowledge, particularly in New Mexico, but even across the US, I haven't heard anything yet. Others may have heard something different. What I will say in New Mexico, so the state's operating budget, the reason we have a surplus right now is because of oil and gas. So oil and gas is our bread and butter. There are lots of organizations, lots of people who have been protesting against fracking, but the fracking continues. Part of the concern with Holtec, and remains the concern with WIP, is that there's so much fracking in southern New Mexico and drilling in southern New Mexico that it's going to eventually create problems if there's nuclear waste buried there, right? We also have the two Project Plowshares experiments that happened in New Mexico, which were Gas Buggy and Nome, where they did explosions underground to try to get oil and gas, right? Which backfired majorly. I would say that this could be something that they're definitely I could foresee this being something that they would definitely look at New Mexico for. Um, um, I'm trying to think of her last name. I'm getting really tired now. Allison, what's Allison's last name?
McFarland.
McFarland, thank you. Allison McFarland, the book that she wrote that she co-edited on Yucca Mountain, about Yucca Mountain, where they were talking about why Yucca Mountain essentially was not a good site, right? A lot of people want to blame the activists for that being the reason why Yucca Mountain fell apart. But actually, the reality is that it was geologically unstable. And Allison, as a geologist, had, her scholarship had something to do with that. And so I think that that's a really interesting example of how and of how, let's just say how, the geologists can play into this. And a lot of them have already done some of that work related to underground facilities for high-level nuclear waste for storage. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes up in the next couple years. I mean, it terrifies me with now the removal of all of these regulations for reactors, right? And now they're going to fast track these 20 new reactors. But I haven't heard anything or read anything about that. And if there's something out there, somebody should share it, because I think you've brought up a really interesting point.
Okay, so Natalie put something really interesting into the chat, and she greeted you in her language and thanked you for the presentation. And I don't want to speak for you, Natalie, if you'd like to say something. I don't, maybe she's not here anymore. I don't see her. Okay, so then the next thing is that Dave Lockbaum is here, and he did have some comments, and he will be our presenter next month. Dave, do you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, Jan, thank you. First of all, thanks, Mariah, for a great presentation. When I worked for the Union of Concerned Scientists, my most reliable allies were the media and local elected officials. How is the media and local elected officials working with you on your concerns?
We have one really good publication locally here called Source New Mexico that I think is the one source publishing really timely pieces. We have another online I don't even know if you call it a publication, news source, I guess, that's been around for a long time called La Jicarita News, and she's great about publishing things as well. Alicia Ines Guzman that I mentioned earlier is sort of one of the go-to journalists who's gotten a lot of national attention. As far as lawmakers, I think that's
I have
sort
to
of
owe you because
interesting now because yeah, it's on at the state level, it's sort of interesting to see it play out. There are a couple people who I think are, without using names, I'm going to give a really interesting example. So two young lawmakers who had just newly been elected came or met or reached out to me. I met with one of them last legislative session, 2025, and they wanted to write a bill to tax plutonium pit production. And, finally, when we met, I said, I don't think this is a great idea. I said, it's going to give them incentive to build more plutonium pits because it's another way for us to get money out of it, like oil and gas, right? I said, if you want to write a bill to tax something in the nuclear industry, tax waste. Write a bill that's going to say, we're going to tax, if you're storing high level waste on site, tax them. And then this will force them to put pressure on the federal government as well. Nothing ever came out of that. No bill was ever written. This other bill in this legislative session that I mentioned earlier, Senate bill, I believe it was 78. I think I said 68 earlier. Senate Bill 78, trying to make renewable energy. I mean, you can nuclear energy, renewable energy. You can also see who was opposing that. It ultimately got tabled and died because it was tabled. But I think we have some junior lawmakers who are very concerned with these issues, and they're trying to establish their footing at the national level. I think we have a great delegation, but they are all supportive of our national laboratories. And, it raises lots of concerns. What does that mean? What does it mean when we're getting over $10 billion to run to run the laboratories from the federal government? They're not gonna turn that money away, but what are the implications? And that's part of the normalization that I'm very concerned with. One of the lawmakers being from our senators, Ben Ray Lujan, being from my hometown. And so yeah, we're not quite there yet, I think. I think it's going to be a lot of public education. There has to be a major paradigm shift, but I don't know what's going to shift that. I don't have that answer yet.
Thanks, Mariah. A few years ago, I got thrown out of Senator Minchy's office. He told me to get the hell out of his office after I raised safety concerns. So I understand the uphill fights you're fighting, and I appreciate what you're doing.
I love hearing that from you. I'm going to commit that to memory, Dave. And you'll notice in that Martin Heinrich letter that I had, you might have seen the line where he was like, Domenici did this, but I've done this, right? So, they're even trying to outdo their predecessors in terms of what we're able to get out of the federal government for the labs, which is interesting. Yeah, Domenici is a really interesting one when you look at the history of how the labs actually built up to what they were. Domenici played a huge part of that.
Well,
Who
we've
kicked
warned you.
Dave out? Which office kicked Dave out?
Domenici.
Ah,
That's a badge of honor. Okay.
Yeah, right.
we've worn you out, Mariah, and there are no more hands up. And I think we've gone through the chat for whatever. You need to pay attention to what Mark Lundholm is saying because he wants you to speak for him, speak at some event. So save the chat and look at this. Thank you. This has been a really great session, and we really appreciate your being here. And I'm turning it back to Dave now to close out.
Okay, thank you, Jan, and thank you, Dr. Gómez. This was a cut above, as they say, I think, and I'm sure you agree we did have a pretty vibrant discussion tonight, so appreciate all that you could stick around for that. I know it wasn't easy. All right, I have mostly housekeeping stuff, and then we'll break. I'll try to run through this quickly. First off, before I got on this session tonight, I was on a Zoom session with an Illinois representative, Sean Casten, who happens to be one of the most incredible climate activist Congress people out there. And he is putting forth a new bill which would improve transmission, speed up getting renewables, efficiency, storage, transmission improvements funded, et cetera, et cetera. I will put the information in the chat. It's called the Electric Bills Relief Act, and you'll have that information that you can look up and bounce off of. And already he's got 120 Democratic co-sponsors. So your homework, folks, is to get your Congress people to become co-sponsors. Second item, Catherine Chuddy, meet Becca Economopoulos. Becca, meet Catherine. I'm glad we could do this tonight. In the chat also, when you get it later, you're going to see at the very top some notices. NEIS is hosting the 2026 International Uranium Film Festival here in Chicago, April 24th through 26th. And we ask that you spread the word about it. Feel free to come to Chicago. I think by that point, we will have some decent weather for y'all. It'll certainly be cooler than what's going on in Arizona and New Mexico. And we probably won't have the snow that Buffalo had. So, and finally, as Jan mentioned, next month, we are really pleased to have Dave Vlockbaum come back for a second go round with us. He's going to be doing a deeper dive on the radiation standard issue from the Executive Order 14300. So that will be on Thursday, April 30th, 7 o'clock Central Time. And you guys can do the math for the other time zones. So, let's see.
I just want to mention that back at the top where you're referring, there's a picture of Mariah's monograph, the book, and it looks very interesting. And I just wanted to point out to people that that's what her book looks like.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So again, thank you, Dr. Gómez. Terrific night. Hope we didn't wear you out too much, and I hope you found it enjoyable. If you could just stick around a couple more minutes after we break, we would appreciate it. And for the rest of you, thank you for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have new people here. And tonight, we had quite a few new folks. Next month, bring a guest. Let's see if we can double these and win this issue by exponential growth. So thank you for joining us tonight with the experts. You will be getting a copy of the chat shortly, and I believe we will have this posted on YouTube somewhere in the next day or so if you want to go back and listen to any of the parts. So again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.